All right, so we're going to get started. We're going to talk about how we can spot misinformation. One of the great things about social media is that you can disseminate a message or information all over the world. But one of the bad things is not everyone's qualified or should be voicing the opinions that they're voicing or the quote unquote facts that they're voicing. So I'm going to talk about how you can spot misinformation, things that should flag your radar and not use your confirmation bias. So don't just believe these things and then actually research them. So I had a talk the other day, and one of the people in the talk said, I listened to your podcast and I was kind of unsure. And then I looked up the information and realized you were right. And I was like, that's exactly what you should do. You should verify. Even everything I say, verify. That's why I post links, and I have a whole folder here in this Google Drive of clinical studies. But people who are experts are what you think they are, meaning that we tend to think that the more confidently someone speaks, the more of an expert they are, when real experts use a lot of nuance. So they say things like may, probably, might, because that's the language around research. So I if you listen to my videos, I'll say things like this may cause XYZ, or this may enhance some, and that's using nuance because in the clinical studies, not everyone experienced those endpoints where you're aggregating data. And overall, if there's a signal there, you're saying, okay, when we observed X amount of people, we did see a signal, but that doesn't mean it was in everyone. So, and as an individual, you may or may not see those effects. People who never admit they are wrong, people who double down when they're proven wrong, people who have expertise and real understanding of the scientific method should change their mind when they're presented with new data. I've changed my mind on lots of different things over the years, and I shared some of those in videos and things like that, things I've changed my mind on, things I've changed my opinion on when I've been presented with new data. If people's claims seem too good to be true, if they seem sensational, if they're too much of a marketing type of claim. I see this a lot when people insist that their own protocol is the only way. In fact, if a practitioner has a protocol that's named after them, you should probably be a little bit leery in that regard, because people who have real clinical experience, people who are practitioners, know that the protocol one size fits all doesn't work for everyone. These practitioners may have a general theory. I have a sandbox that I give people, and we tinker and play with things inside of that sandbox. Over reliance on a protocol indicates that someone's really good at reading and theorizing, but not actually being a practitioner. Another thing that you can look at is their credentials or area of expertise. People should be talking about things that they have some credentials in, that they have some verification in. There's a difference between someone who can conjecture or make theory. There's a difference between someone who's watched somebody do something, and there's a difference between someone who's a practitioner who's actually done and worked with things. So I tend to follow people and listen to people who are practitioners, people who take the theory and then apply it in their everyday lives with people. They're going to use nuance, and they're going to see different scenarios and how things work out. They tend to be experts. And when you're looking at something and someone posts a study, really look at it. Look at what is it doing? Because a lot of times, and I see this a lot in the carnivore community, they take mechanisms. Oh, there's these defense chemicals in plants. And if we give a lot of that to a rat, then it causes these adverse effects. And they don't really mention that it's rat studies or mechanistic studies, and they never talk about human outcomes. So if you never hear someone talk about human outcomes, a human study, and that it's a preponderance of evidence, so not just one study, this is what the totality of the evidence shows, then that's probably someone who may be giving misinformation. So if you look at all of my stuff, I'm mostly talking about human studies. I talk about a lot of data analyses, and I talk about studies in the context of other studies. That's really, really important. So people who do that are more trustworthy. People who look at human outcomes. If I talk about an observational study, I usually say the same observational caveats apply. Correlation does not equal causation. And then I'll talk about some of the pitfalls of observational studies. Not that observational studies are garbage. People who say that, that's a red flag right there. Observational studies can be useful, but you have to understand the context. Just like animal studies and mechanistic studies can be useful, but you can't extrapolate mechanistic or animal studies into human outcomes. People who talk about toxin, this is can be a big red flag. They are all talking about toxins and chemicals, and they never mention a specific toxin or chemical by name. And then you have to dive further into it. Are we talking about an animal study? We've talked about before that animal studies often use way higher doses. They may use continuous exposure. So the animal is just repeatedly exposed 24/7 to that. So you can't extrapolate that to a human. And then in the human studies, are we talking about environmental exposure, which would be like if I'm going about my everyday life, how much of this am I exposed to? Or are we talking about occupational exposure? We saw this a lot with glyphosate. A lot of the data on glyphosate initially was occupational exposure, people working with it in, farms and stuff like that. That's a different exposure level than environmental exposure. So whenever I talk about toxins and potential adverse effects, I'm talking about, was the study environmental or was it occupational? And if they talk about a dose effect, and then if there's specific effects, if someone just claims something's toxic and then doesn't talk about specific effects or specific organs or dosage, was it environmental, occupational, then that should be a red flag. Another instance is in nutrition. We see this a lot where people talk about mechanisms without outcome data. We just covered that. We covered observational studies without caveats. If they're really focused on ingredients, and this is something that I used to be guilty of, that I would really focus on some ingredient. And again, you can find a mechanistic study with any ingredient and show harm if you give animals a ridiculous amount of that ingredient. But really, you need to focus on human outcomes, like we talked about. Are there human outcome studies showing harm, and what dose and what population? And then really dietary patterns, because we don't typically just eat one food in isolation. We eat foods in a whole dietary pattern. And as I dove more into the evidence, I started to realize that the pattern of which people eat foods, and there are associations, like people who eat the most red meat tend to eat lower amounts of fruit and vegetable. We see these dietary patterns across evidence. And so when you're looking at the result of a nutritional observational study, you have to take into account these dietary patterns. So do they talk about that dietary patterns, or do they talk about single ingredient mechanistic, and they're not talking about outcomes? And in general, anybody who does supermarket videos, that should be a red flag. I have no idea why people are still doing those. People who say stuff and don't post links to studies. Or if they post a link to the study and you go and look at it and the study doesn't even talk about anything that they said, that's a huge red flag. Extrapolating rat studies to humans without caveats. You are making a hypothesis that is not something that you can directly correlate. In the supplement space, there's a lot of misinformation, people using a bunch of anecdote. We've talked about this in the placebo and belief effect, that anecdote could be the effect, beneficial effect, could all be placebo and belief effect. You need human randomized controlled trials showing an effect to know if there's actually a signal there from that product. When they don't link data, or they link data and it's a rat study, if they don't discuss doses and adverse effects, that's a big red flag. If you look, whenever I talk about supplements, not all the time, but I usually try to do so, just like the curcumin video I posted, I talk about the adverse effects because people like to think that supplements do not have adverse effects. That is not true. Supplements do have adverse effects. And if they're studied in human randomized controlled trials, you can see what those adverse effects are. So I talked about with curcumin, a lot of the adverse effects that they saw in studies for osteoarthritis were gastrointestinal, and that they didn't see severe side effects. So that's the thing that people who are experts in this type of stuff, they will mention, they will tell you doses. I always, if it's available, will link doses. I link the doses that were studied in that particular curcumin study. I link the adverse effects. These are things that are green flags when people do that. If they don't do that, that should be a red flag, and you should really scrutinize what that person is saying. If they don't discuss the population it's studied in, this is something I see a lot in neurotropics. I posted this on Instagram that you really have to be careful on these nootropics because people will be like, oh, it improves cognition. Well, what population? Is it people who are 50? Is it people who are 20? Is it people with mild cognitive impairment? Is it people with dementia? Because it may improve cognitive function in people with dementia. That doesn't necessarily mean, and we've seen this before, that it improves cognition in a healthy 20-year-old. So I look at that very carefully, like what population has it shown improvements in? And that could be with any type of supplement. Is it studied and in what population did it show improvement in? Because you can't just extrapolate that to a general population if it was studied in a specific population. So again, people who are well versed in this stuff will mention the populations that it will study in, will mention caveats, will mention adverse effects. Another thing is people talking about supplements who don't emphasize the basics. I talk about the basics over and over again: mindset, nutrition, exercise, stress management, sleep. Those are biggest bang for your buck right there by far. And then I talk about supplements who and which use cases they may be beneficial. If you're looking to do this, or if this is your goal, or if you're in this population, this supplement is beneficial. Anyone who says, oh, one supplement is beneficial for everybody, that's marketing. That's not exactly how this works. So, I see all the time colostrum and then a whole bunch of MLM products. A lot of these MLM products are very poorly formulated. They have proprietary blends. We've talked about that in the Know Your Supplements. They're expensive and they have very limited utility because a lot of these combinations that they're thrown together haven't been studied together. So, how do I know that and this is another good point. If you have a blend of different supplements together and each one has shown individual benefit, you can't extrapolate that the combination together will have benefit unless it's been studied. And some companies do studies on their products. And I've been in these discussions. I've worked with supplement companies, consulted with supplement companies, formulated supplements. So I know that. Another huge misinformation red flag is using scare tactics to sell their products. I'm seeing this a lot where they make you afraid of something which may or may not even be relevant, and then all of a sudden have the solution to that. And then they don't discuss side effects of their product. They don't discuss um, what specifically the product is doing. They don't discuss severity. They just say, oh my God, if you're using this, this is terrible. I'm seeing this a lot with Ozempic. And the side effects are real for Ozempic. We see them, but they're way overblown. And I'm seeing people say, don't take Ozempic for these side effects. Well, what side effect? In what population? In what dose? Right? Because I've read pretty much all the randomized controlled trials using semaglutide. And the discontinuation rate for adverse effects is not nearly as high as what people online make it seem to be. And the rate of serious adverse effects is not nearly as high as what people make it seem online. But if I play on your fear, if I make you scared to take it, and then I have this natural semaglutide over here for you to take. Well, now I'm selling you a product, right? So be careful of people using scare tactics for something, tell you to be afraid of something, but then go and take their product or use this instead. And they have an affiliate link or something like that. That should make you question, is this really in my best interest or are they trying to line their pocket? So that's been a 15-minute conversation on some things that I see that are red flags or misinformation. Are there things that you've seen? Are there things I should have added to the list? I think this is a really, really important topic because I've seen so many social media accounts blow up that are full of misinformation. And I'm not a debunking guy. I don't think that's helpful. I think it's really important to inform people about how to spot misinformation, how to spot things that don't seem right, what to do about it, and how to spot people who are experts, who are trustworthy. So thank you for your time and attention, and I'll figure out something to talk about in our next town hall. Y'all have a blessed evening.